Welcome to this presentation. It's an updated version of a talk I gave to Bet Shalom congregation here in Adelaide on the 1st of June, 2020. I have taken out the first part that dealt with thinking, systems thinking, and problem solving, and just focused on the second half and reformatted it and added an extra thought. The reason I've done that, it was getting too long. It actually was too long, and much of the thinking and the problem solving aspects of it are covered in other videos. So, moving on. Why use system thinking, or what's in it for you? Let me just go over that briefly. It was Rabbi Chaim Moshe Luzzatto who wrote, "When people know a number of things and one of them understands how the things are systematically categorized and related, that person has an advantage over the others who don't have the same understanding." And ironically, he was writing about God's commandments. And I'm going to give you an example of how you can do that yourself later on in this talk. From my personal experience, you see solutions where other people see problems, you see connections, you see ambiguity, and so you can make jokes, many of which are poor, but in English, a lot of humor is based on ambiguity. You think for yourself, so you're less likely to be manipulated by other people, and you may get a reputation for asking good questions. And if you think up a question in a particular situation and you don't keep your mouth shut, you will probably get yourself into trouble. Been there, done that 5 times. So the objectives of this talk are to summarize the holistic thinking perspectives, apply systems thinking and beyond to some Jewish issues to make you think about them, and to change the way you think about Judaism. So why am I giving this talk? That's the first topic I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to go through and summarize systems thinking and beyond, and then thoughts and topics on 11 different Jewish issues, which I hope you will find entertaining, educational, and challenging. These are the topics I'm going to think about: social injustice, detailed observance instructions in ultra-orthodox publications, blessings before doing something, the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath, Goy and Jew, the second day of a Jewish holiday, and how did "thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk," that's the biblical commandment, turn into the rabbinical prohibition of consuming milk and meat products in the same meal. The priority of the commandments, separation of church and state, the 11th commandment, and no, it is not thou shalt not get caught. It's one that's actually in the Torah, and some aspects of the Yizkor prayer. So why am I giving this talk? Well, my traditional Jewish teaching was memorization. And if you've seen the video Shtisel or any other similar videos that, or you understand what the Orthodox community is about, children learn the Talmud, but they don't think about it. They learn, this rabbi said this rabbi said that, and where this and this was written. It's all memorization. My rabbi in 3rd and 4th grade was totally different. He's the only one of my teachers who encouraged me to question. But he didn't tell me I'd need to think in order to create the question, and he didn't teach me to think. And it took me years to learn to think. And slowly I began to ask questions. First question is why? That's the question children learn. They start with that. So this talk is paying forward. I can't pay him back. I'm not sure how I would pay him back either, because he's taken me out of my comfort zone a lot. It encourages you to ask questions, and I provide some examples of systems thinking and questioning some Jewish issues. So in order to apply systems thinking, the first thing you have to do is to have a set of perspectives. Why? Do you remember the story about the blind men feeling the elephant? Each one feels a different part of the elephant and they perceive a different animal. Well, in order to use systems thinking, you have to be all the blind men and perceive the system or the issue from a number of different perspectives. And then you will begin to be able to get an understanding of what's going on. There are no standard set of perspectives that are out there in common use. You ever heard people say, let's make sure we're on the same page, or engineers talk about being on the same wavelength? What they're saying in reality is, let's make sure we're looking at something from the same perspective. So I did some research 10 or more years ago under a grant from the Leverhulme Foundation that helped me learn how to teach systems thinking. And it developed these standard perspectives. The big picture and the operational, those are systems thinking perspectives, and they're used by a lot of the systems thinkers. Functional and structural perspectives are used to analyze something. So if you need to know how something is used, then you look at those first two. If you need to know where it's used and how it's used, you look at the systems perspective. If you understand how something works, because if you need to understand how something works because you've got a problem with it, you look at the functional and the structural perspectives. For example, if your car breaks down and you need to figure out what's wrong with the car, understanding how the car is used, or the big picture about cars driving the economy, isn't pertinent to that particular situation. So you need both of them. You need all four of those perspectives. And then if you're trying to fix something, you need perceptions, perspectives that help you with finding solutions. And they come from generic, continuum, and temporal and quantitative perceptions. And then after you've been thinking about something and you have come up with an idea, that is the scientific perspective. And these 9 perspectives also provide a nice template for collecting and organizing information, as I'll show you in a moment. So if I want to go back to the parable of the blind men looking at the elephant, you need to be that blind man, or all the blind men, and use the systems perspectives for the big picture and the operational, then the functional and structural analysis perspectives, then the generic, continuum, and temporal perspective, where generic is looking at that system and similarities, continuum is looking at differences, temporal is looking at how something evolves over time, the quantitative perspective provides the numbers that goes with all of those, and the scientific is the output of the thought process. And as the elephant realizes, it's a useful template for collecting and organizing information. So there's the elephant in the room, and what we're going to do is perceive it from different viewpoints. Now, one of the tools that I teach in my classes is the systems thinking matrix for active brainstorming. Traditional brainstorming poses a question and then the ideas come and then eventually the ideas run out. Well, in active brainstorming, what you do is you say, we're going to look at something or perceive something from the big picture. And then you start asking who, what, where, when, why, and how questions. These are the Kipling questions, or at least I call them Kipling questions, because Rudyard Kipling seems to have invented them in his The Elephant's Child in his Just So stories. So for example, from the operational perspective, you might ask, who's using it? When is it being used? Why is it being used? How is it being used? The structural perspective might be what's in it. What is it made of? Generic perspective might be what's it similar to. Continuum perspective would be how is it different from? A temporal perspective is, this is another fine mess you've got me into. How did we get into it? And so on and so forth. And I've written this all up in my books and my YouTube videos, so I'm not going to go through it anymore. I'm just going to use it in this talk. So if we look at the big picture, the big picture deals with the context and the assumptions. So we look around the big picture, we see Jews in society being Jewish, but they don't really think about what it means. We see anti-Semitism in the Christian and the Muslim worlds, and other perceptions which I haven't written down. We go to the operational perspective. Operational perceptions deal with what the system does. It's a black box perspective, so we're not interested in the details, we just look at what's going on. When we look there, we see complying with the commandments or not, attending services and other religious events like circumcisions. We see community and charity work being done. We see speaking out against injustice. We see Jews contributing to science. If you look at the ratio of Jews to general population, the number of Nobel Prizes, Jews exceed that ratio. And Jews contributing to the arts, particularly in movies, and so on and so forth. The structural perspective deals with how the system is constructed and organized, hierarchies and classifications. So if we look at that, we see definitions. Some of the definitions are based on reality, and some of the definitions are based on fantasy or wishful thinking. We see the commandments, and we see divine commandments, rabbinic commandments, tradition, and so on. We also see no organized hierarchy. Every Jew has the same connection with God. There are no middlemen. God is in your phone, just as in every other Jewish person's phone, and every other person, according to Judaism. So here's some definitions. If you look up the definition of Judaism, Jewish, or Jew, it really depends where you look it up. The definition of Judaism depends. There are many definitions. Some of them contain some history, aspects of belief, and so on. I like the one I have developed. I've pared it down to a minimum, and I say it's a way of life based on the commandments in the 5 books of Moses. There are no commandments on what to believe, only on what to do and what not to do. As long as you carry out those commandments, it doesn't matter if you believe in them or not. You get the benefits of doing so. Jewish, well, I looked at the Free Dictionary amongst many other places, and of or relating to the Jews or their culture or religion, and the definition of a Jew in the same place. The dictionary has 3 definitions. Another definition is a person with a Jewish parent, only mother according to Orthodox Jewry, and so on. Commandments, those are the fundamental aspect of Judaism. So let's take a look. What is a commandment? It's an imperative verb. For example, thou shalt do something, or honor thy father and thy mother. And so at a system level, we can talk about what. For example, here's a commandment. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Or Hillel rephrased it as, what is hateful to thee, do not unto thy fellow. This is the whole law. So he was summarizing what we call the person-to-person laws in this one sentence. And then we go down to their other commandments, like these 3 extracts from the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet. And then there's some examples. So you take the high-level commandment, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, and then you can look at these out of the 10. These are ways of loving thy neighbor. And I can draw that in a hierarchy like this. There's a total system of commandments. I can take that Leviticus 19:17, which is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, as the high-level person-to-person commandment. And then I can take those commandments in the 10 Commandments, and then the one about covet in Exodus 20:17, thou shalt not covet. It has examples in it, so I can break that out into a sub-commandment, a sub-commandment, a sub-commandment. And similarly, there's another set of commandments starting in Deuteronomy 6:5, and thou shalt love thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might, which is what we Jews call the Shema. And you can break that hierarchy out into ways of showing love of God. And then there's a third set, which are temple-based, that deal with the ritual in the temple, which today no longer apply because there isn't a temple. The same structure, that hierarchy, is 4 different sets. There's the original written divine commandments from which all the laws are based. It's a well thought out system for community interaction. It contains a number of do's and don'ts, and you either do or don't something to provide benefit to the community and yourself, or to preclude harm to the community or yourself. Then there's the oral law. Rabbinic tradition holds it as being delivered at the same time as the written law, but not written down. It was later written down by the rabbis and edited into the Mishnah. Then there's rabbinic law, which states that one should build a fence around the divine law to prevent violation of divine commandments by accident. And then there are customs. The Torah defines the Jewish people as being holy. So under rabbinic guidance, the customs themselves have become holy over the centuries and have taken on the power of commandments. Okay. A functional perspective deals with what the system does and how it does it. It's a white box perspective. So we look at the functions performed in the scenarios. We see Jews performing the daily commandments or not. We see them making blessings by rote. If you watch Shtisel, you would have seen every now and again, just before drinking something, the person will mumble a few words and then go on and drink. Now, if you understand what the mumbling is, it's a blessing. It's a reminder to it thanks God for providing the drink. And yet, they don't stop to think about it. They just mumble the words and move on. They're doing it by rote. They don't seem to understand what they're doing. Generic. The generic perception is similarities and different similarities. So this is similarities with other religions and similarities between the various sects. So you might see similarities between Chabad and Satmar or Buvava or other Hasidic groups. There are similarities between Orthodox and Reform and so on. And then similarity between Judaism and other religions. And then the continuum perspective deals with differences. For example, there are differences between Israel and the diaspora. There are differences between Judaism and other religions. There are differences between the sects, between Chabad, conservative, Hasidic, Orthodox, progressive, and Reform. And one of the differences I've noticed is talking during the services. In the Orthodox synagogue, there's a lot of talking. there's this buzz of conversation all the time during the prayers. At the point where every now and again somebody stands up and yells quiet. And Orthodox synagogues, with all that buzz of conversation, have signs up that say it is forbidden to talk during prayers. And yet, in the Reform and the Progressive synagogues, there's no talking and there's no signs. I remember the first time, having been brought up in an Orthodox synagogue, the first time I was asked to read the Haftarah in a conservative synagogue. When I was asked, I thought about it. Yeah, I said, nobody's listening anyhow. They're all talking, so I might as well do it. And when I got up there, I said the blessing, and I began to read the Haftarah. You could have heard a pin drop. Put me off my stroke for a moment. But I managed. They asked me again, so it worked. And then there's a difference in attitude about Judaism. It is looked down in the West. But when I'm in China, and I was in Singapore in the Chinese community, and I said I was Jewish, the attitude was, wow, you must be smart. I smiled. Big difference. And then there is a difference between the diaspora relationship with modern Israel and with the historical states of Israel. One of it, of course, being political, and the other one being religious. The temporal perspective is perceptions of the past, present, and future of the system. So if we look down into the past, we see Mount Sinai, the prophets, the partition into Judea and Israel. We see the temple phase, and then when we get to Roman times, we see the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees being temple orientated and the Pharisees being the rabbinic side. And we realize that the Sadducees were the Orthodox Judaism of the day that could trace their roots all the way back to the temple-based commandments in Mount Sinai. And the Pharisees were the Reform or Progressive Judaism of their time. We see Judaism spreading out northeast, south, and west from the Holy Land via trade or slavery. We see persecution in the Christian and later in the Muslim world. We see ghettos, we see the emancipation and freedom, and then we see assimilation. We saw the Holocaust most recently. And in the present time, we've got Israel and the diaspora, and we've got different sects of Judaism. And the future, who knows, but eventually some people believe the Messiah will come and resolve everything. The quantitative perception deals with numbers and statistics and other information. So it will give us the numbers of Jews, the 10 commandments, the 613 commandments, or the traditional number, 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. A positive commandment is a do, a negative commandment is a don't. And then 10 Jews constitute a minyan or a quorum. Ever asked yourself why? Why do we need 10 Jews for a minyan? I'm not going to tell you, look it up. The scientific perspective gives you it's a prescriptive perspective. It's not something you observe or you feel or you perceive. It's the output of your thinking, the outcome of the thought process. So it's your hypothesis or guess about the issue, cause, or solution after thinking about it. And the inferences and conclusion depends on the problem issues. So notice here, Sherlock is not looking at something with his magnifying glass. He's thinking of something. And then he will speak it or write it. Okay, time for a short break. I did say short. Next part, now we get to the fun part, thoughts on Jewish issues, social injustice, detailed observance instructions, blessings, commandments, Sabbath, second day, prohibition, priority of the commandment, separation of church and state, the 11th commandment, and the Yizkor prayer. So, moving right along, social injustice. Structural. What does social injustice mean? Well, it's a situation where some unfair practices are being carried out in society. Cut and paste from the website. Operational. So social injustice occurs when the equals are treated in an unequal way and the unequals are treated in an equal way. Functional. You see some Jews treating Jews in an unequal way and others do not. Sorry, I said some Jews are treating, I should have said non-Jews in an unequal way, and others do not. From a continuum perspective, there is a difference between doing social injustice and seeing it being done. One is active, one is passive. So let's look at not doing it, or doing it with a few examples. We have this command, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay. Hillel turned it into his golden rule, what is hateful unto thee, do not unto thy fellow. This is the whole law of the set of commandments between person to person, behavioral. So neighbor, but there's actually more. But the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born amongst you, and thou shalt love him as thyself, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Shall be unto you as one born among you. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for ye were strangers in the land of God, Egypt. Oops. And thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger as for one in your own country, for I am the Lord your God. And this one in Deuteronomy, which is, thou shalt do that is with that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord. So social injustice seems to be forbidden in the Torah to both Jews and strangers. Now, who or what is a stranger? There are some Jewish authorities that says the stranger applies to a non-Jewish stranger. Sorry, the stranger applies to a Jewish stranger only. So you are allowed to vex non-Jewish strangers. You can cheat them. You can discriminate against them and be rather nasty. So who is a stranger? Let's look back through the Bible. And we find in Exodus, and I appeared unto Abram, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob by the name of God Almighty, but not by my name was I not known to them. And I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers. Okay. Now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were strangers in the land of Canaan. There weren't any other Jews there. There weren't any Jews there, if you want to be technical. So they're no family members. So strangers don't seem to apply. So strangers seems to apply to people outside the tribe rather than inside the tribe. But if we look at the laws over Passover, in amongst them we find this is the ordinance of the Passover, and we're talking about the Passover sacrifice. There shall no stranger eat thereof. Okay? And it is very clear who a stranger is, because 5 sentences down, when a stranger shall sojourn with thee and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and eat it. So this is definitely defining a stranger as somebody who is uncircumcised, And so all the rabbinical authorities that say it's okay to ill-treat non-Jewish strangers, and they're not many of them, okay, don't get me wrong, they're not many of them, are absolutely breaking a commandment in the Torah. The Torah forbids social injustice. All right, it forbids social injustice, but what about seeing it being done? Is there anything in the Torah about that? Well, there isn't. But you can look at this Torah, this commandment in what was my bar mitzvah sedra, and it says, thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. What is a stumbling block? Well, it's something that a blind person would fall over if they walked into it. But it's been interpreted metaphorically as placing any kind of implement before people. And this can be interpreted as something that is wrong. Somebody is doing something wrong. But there is no direct commandment. So even if you see something doing wrong, somebody doing wrong, there is no direct commandment. Or is there? Think. What if it was happening to you? Apply the golden rule. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Speak out. Remove it if you can. Speak out against it if you can't. So you can infer that there is a commandment to speak out and remove social injustice if you can. That is the Jewish attitude to social injustice, scientific perspective, the hypothesis. Many Jews do so and have done so over the years. So this may be one of the reasons for anti-Semitism. It's deflecting attention away from the wronggoers and blaming the Jews. Oh, by the way, out of all these do unto others commandments, what is the one that is so easy to do, but is hardly ever done, feels so good when somebody does it to you, but you hardly ever do it to anybody else? Think. The answer is the thank you. Saying thank you. It takes so little effort to do it, yet so few people do it. And it feels really great when somebody says it to you. Isn't it nice to be appreciated? Make a new resolution that as from today, you will start saying thank you. And by the way, you will find that you get benefits from it if you say thank you in restaurants or in transportation or whatever. I used to say thank you when I got off the bus at the university in Singapore on the inter-university bus lines. And after a while, I noticed that there was no designed stopping place for the bus with all these people waiting, but quite often the bus stopped with a door in front of me. And when I noticed that, I realized that the bus drivers were the ones I had been saying thank you to. Coincidence? I don't know. But you go into a restaurant, you say thank you. Next time you come back, or after a few times, the service will improve. So there's a benefit in it to you as well. Detailed Jewish observances. In the ultra-orthodox world, there is a publication that publishes religious books. And there are very detailed instructions for how you say the prayers, how you prepare for the holidays, and so on and so forth. I find it really interesting because in that book, it says if you miss a word or you, under certain circumstances, or even most circumstances, you have to go back and repeat the prayer. Whereas in the progressive synagogue, they've thrown out all those prayers. But anyhow, the rules and regulations are extremely detailed. So about 15 years ago, I wrote this based on something that 5 years earlier had been circulating anonymously on the internet. I call it Conceptual Laws and Customs of Christmas. And if Christmas had been a Jewish holiday, Art Scroll might have written a book, something like this: preparing for Christmas, the tree, decorating the tree, the Christmas lights, gifts, the office party, and so on. And even the non-Jewish people who've looked at it find it very funny. So let me give you a couple of examples. The size of the tree. The required height of the tree is as follows. Section 2, paragraph 6. According to Bet Shammai, an indoor tree must be tall enough so that the space between the top of the tree and the ceiling is less than 1 cubit. An outdoor tree must be at least 20 cubits tall. On the other hand, Beit Hillel state that the size doesn't matter. It is the overall effect that is important. And notice there are 2 notes in there. Note 9, where the local fire codes prohibit the use of such large trees, a smaller tree may be used in accordance with the principle that Jewish religious laws do not overrule the secular law of the country. Point 10, the ruling is according to Bet Hillel, namely size doesn't matter. Gentlemen, you have it from Bet Hillel, size doesn't matter. Or how about the office holiday party? There are a number of commandments that deal with the office holiday party. They come in section 6. Section 3, Commandment 3 goes, the mitzvah of holding a holiday party requires a great deal of ritual drinking. One must drink and continue drinking up to the point where he cannot tell the difference between his wife and his secretary. And there are 4 points on there. Point 7. In this case, up to means up to but not including the point where he cannot tell the difference. Once one has reached this point, he is excused from further drinking, although those zealous in the performance of this mitzvah often continue drinking past this point. This mitzvah also presumes that he is a male and his secretary is female. However, if his secretary is male and he has reached the point where he cannot tell the difference between his wife and his male secretary, then he, no matter how zealous, is forbidden to drink any more alcohol until Purim. If we go back to 9, it's an accept. If you are the designated driver, you're accepted from the mitzvah, or you have an excuse, the word is excluded from the mitzvah. Some authorities suggest that in the spirit of Christmas, as a designated driver, you donate whatever amount of money you would have spent on alcoholic drinks to the local yeshiva. And since the mitzvah is to imbibe alcohol, one is not permitted to use grape juice for this performance of the mitzvah. So if the others are drinking wine, you are not permitted to use grape juice. Let's think about the blessings before something. Jews often say a blessing before doing something, like before drinking or whatever, some other action. And it's Baruch Atah Asher Kitshana b'mitzvotav v'tzivana. So let's think about, where do we make those blessings, or where were we commanded to make those blessings, and when? And I want to use the example of Kindle, the Shabbat light. Every Friday night, women, Jewish women all over the world recite the blessing, L'hadlik ner shel Shabbat, to kindle the Sabbath light. So where does it say that? And when did it say, or when did it say it? So you look in the Torah and you find in Exodus, remember the Sabbath day, thou shalt not do any work. You look in Deuteronomy, it says, keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, thou shalt not do any work. Do you see any sign of candle? Any mention of candle? Nope. We looked in the Ten Commandments. Well, Sabbath day was one of the Ten Commandments. So let's take a look. Ten Commandments, right? Throughout history, people have talking about the Ten Commandments. There are 3 mentions of the Ten Commandments in the Torah. Exodus, Deuteronomy, and the mention is in the context of writing them on 2 tables of stone. Okay. Here's an example. You look at the commandments and you can see that their continuum perspective, there are 2 different types. There is the person to person, you shall not steal, and there's the person to God, you shall have no other God before me. I showed that in the structural perspective. But when you look at this and you look at a similar one, you can see differences. No? First one with the Hebrews starts, I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The second one starts with, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and includes, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, which is not in the first one, which is not in the tablets. I am the Lord thy God is a statement. There is no verb there. It is not a commandment. So how many commandments are there? How many commandments are there in the 10 Commandments? In 3,000 years of history, has nobody asked this question? Now, the answer can be 10, another specific number, I don't know, and I don't care. But wait a minute, there are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. How many in Exodus chapter 20? Remember back to it, the question about the Sabbath. Those? No. All right, I'll put you out of your misery. There are 14. Excluding examples of the generic prohibition, or 24 if you include. So remember I talked about commandments, sub-commandments, system, subsystem. So if you want to include the examples, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ox, ass, etc., or anything of thy neighbor's, you can make the commandment, thou shalt not covet anything of thy neighbor's, and the examples as sub-commandments and not include them, or include them. But the number is 14 or 24. And in Deuteronomy, it's the same. So why have we been talking about 10 Commandments? Because God wrote that there were 10 Commandments. Now, that must mean that what's written in Exodus and Deuteronomy, those 14, are not the original. Something doesn't add up. That's all I can say about this. One of those 10 commandments, the Sabbath, is based on one of those 10 commandments. And so in Exodus, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. And similarly in Devarim, we have, or Deuteronomy, we have, keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it as the Lord thy God has commanded thee. 6 days thou shalt labor, but the 7th day in it thou shalt not do any work. So how many commandments are there here? There's 3 or 4 commandments in one. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy is a commandment. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Remembering and keeping are 2 different activities. Those are 2 different commandments. 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord, thou shalt not do any work. Okay, that's the same in both of them. What about this one? 6 days thou shalt labor. That's a verb. That's a commandment. That's one everybody's totally forgotten about. There is a commandment in the Old Testament, in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, whatever you want to call it, to work 6 days a week. Look it up for yourself. And not only there, it's mentioned over and over and over again. And here is a number of other places. And Jewish tradition said that holds that there is no repetition in the Torah. In the translation, there is a repetition. Maybe in the original Hebrew there isn't. Look it up if you don't believe me. The commandment to work is there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there. So, where is the divine commandment to light candles? I never found it. On the other hand, does lighting candles fulfill the commandment to sanctify the Sabbath? If it is, the blessing should not be who has commanded us to light Shabbat candles, it's who has commanded us to sanctify the Sabbath, and we do it by lighting the Shabbat candles. Does working a 5-day week violate the commandment to work 6 days? And what happens after crossing the date line? The rabbinical ruling to observe the local Sabbath violates the divine commandment, because depending on which way you cross it, you either go for a 5-day week or a 7-day week, because you lose a day going from Australia to the United States and you gain a day coming back. What about the Shabbat Goy? Let's take the full text of the commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that was in the gates. A premise. The Shabbat Goy is either a manservant, a maidservant, or a stranger, or an ass. I told you, you can see connections and poor jokes. Since we have already shown that a stranger is a non-Jew, even though some rabbinic authorities define a stranger as being a Jewish stranger, the conclusion is the Shabbat Goy is a violation of the commandments, and Shabbat Goys are not allowed, or you are not allowed to employ a Shabbat Goy by divine law. Applying the continuum perspective, think about that list of people. Who's missing? There is no prohibition on thy wife from working. So do you interpret that as women are exempted from the rule once they get married? Or that God is addressing women and thou includes men and women? Because if women are included, then they have an obligation to perform the commandments, which means they need to be allowed to study the Torah to know what they've let themselves in for. And so any sect of Judaism that forbids women from studying the Torah is wrong. What about the Shabbat Jew? A Shabbat Goy is somebody who gets paid to work on the Sabbath. A Shabbat Jew gets paid to work on the Sabbath or holiday. Are there such people? Well, think about it from the operational perspective. Somebody leads the prayers by chanting. Oops. We call this a chazan or a cantor. How many synagogues would pay their cantor if he or she did not sing the service on Saturdays? That's the test. Or leading the services in the synagogue and chanting the Torah portion. That is one of the duties of the rabbi in many progressive synagogues, or the cantor. Preparing the synagogue and tidying it up before and after the services. That is the job of the beadle or the shamash. One of my father's jobs when I was growing up was to be the beadle in the United Synagogue in Stamford Hill, London, England. Or leading high holiday services in outlying communities. I had friends who used to travel, used to take a plane and travel to outlying communities where there weren't very many Jews and lead the services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And they would get paid for it. One of them boasted about it. That's forbidden by divine commandment. And some rabbis may even work 7 days a week. Absolutely forbidden. How do the rabbis justify that they can break the law, whereas us non-rabbis should not? Here's another one. The second day of a Jewish holiday. This big picture. I was living in Jerusalem. I had overseas visitors staying with us, and it was the second evening of a holiday. From an operational perspective, I kept 1 day of the holiday. They kept 2 days of the holiday. So the functional perspective was that evening I made Havdalah and they made Kiddush. So thinking about it, it doesn't make sense. We were in the same place. Why am I keeping 1 day and are they keeping 2 days? So you do some research. We go back to the biblical commandment that says the first day of the month is set based on hearing the testimony of witnesses who've seen the moon. It was only known after the fact, so the first day of Rosh Hashanah was not predictable. But that's fine. You've got a small community and everybody's close, and so you can do that. But by the period of the prophets, the community in the Holy Land had grown to be the whole country, and the outlying areas could not be sure when to celebrate the holiday. They could not be sure they'd hear in time. And so the religious authorities instituted some risk management. They'll keep 2 days based on the expected day because they knew roughly when it would happen, because they could tell the month of Elul was coming to an end. And it allowed the whole country to keep the correct day, which was either the first or the second day. Since the days of the holidays later in the month were then known, there was no need for 2 days for those days. If we look at it from the quantitative perspective, we can see that Rosh Hashanah, New Year, is the only one with this problem. Because by the time you get to Yom Kippur, it's on the 10th day of the month, and so you already know what day it is. Similarly, Tabernacles and Passover are in the middle of the month. Well, as far as Tabernacles is concerned, it's 5 days after Day of Atonement. Passover is in the middle of the month, so there's no problem there. Pentecost is in the 6th day of the month, which is okay, but even if there was a problem basing it on the new moon, it's on the 50th day of the Omer. So once you know when the first day of Passover was, Pentecost is 50 days later, so there's absolutely no ambiguity as to the date. keep going on the temporal perception. During the Babylonian exile and later, the beacon fires carried the announcement to Babylon. But by Roman times, the beacon fires were changed to sending out messengers because neighboring sects sent out false beacons, because the Jews and the Samaritans and whoever were not very happy with each other, much like what's going on in the Holy Land today. And so this was extended for some reason to apply to all the holidays in exile communities except the Day of Atonement. Now, to me, that seems wrong, because the Day of Atonement is really the day on which you have to reflect on your behavior. And so that day should be the correct day. But it's difficult to keep 2 days, so they relaxed it. When we converted to a calculated calendar, we retained the tradition of 2 days. And it was based on geographical location, Israel and the diaspora. In Israel, you kept 1 day. In the diaspora, you kept 2 days. Why did we retain the tradition? I'll leave you to work that out. But in modern Israel, it's based on nationality. Israelis keep 1 day wherever they are. Non-Israelis keep 2 days wherever they are. So if an Israeli goes outside Israel, they only keep 1 day. If a non-Israeli goes into Israel, they keep 2 days. That's why I made Havdalah and they made Kiddush. But if you think about the situation, by changing the requirement to be based on nationality and not on location, the Orthodox rabbinate have quietly abolished the 2-day diaspora transition without telling anybody. Religious Jews are no longer required to maintain 2 days, according to the Israeli Orthodox rabbinate and the Orthodox rabbinate in the diaspora who have accepted the situation. This one is fascinating. How did "thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk" turn into prohibition of consuming milk and meat in the same meal? In the temporal perception, we have this specific divine commandment, Exodus 20:13, which I just quoted up top. When cooking kid goat meat. The generic rabbinical commandment of today forbids consuming meat and poultry and milk products in the same meal. Not only that, it requires a separation, that you have to wait a certain amount of time before you can eat milk products after eating a meat meal. And that separation is inconsistent. Some keep 6, some keep 3, and some keep 1. If that's in the oral law, well, the oral law is inconsistent. Also, show me where the chicken provides its milk. So how did this situation occur? Well, I can make some inferences in which need to be researched to see if they're correct. Some of it might come from building a fence. You're cooking kids' goat meat. Okay, well, let's forbid eating milk with calf, with baby cows, because you might get confused. Okay, so after a while, we've forbidden that. And then somebody else will come along a little further and we'll build a fence that says, wait a minute, how do you know the difference between a baby meat and regular meat? Let's just forbid it for all meat so that we won't accidentally do it. And then later on, you might get to a point where somebody will say, well, you know, it might confuse chicken and meat, so let's just forbid chicken as well. And so you find that over the centuries, they build a fence around a fence around a fence, because people have forgotten, or they're not taught what the original divine commandment was. They don't think about it. They sort of might learn or read the Chumash and go right through the 5 books of Moses, but they don't think about it. They just read it in the same way as those people mumble the blessing before drinking a glass of water or some Scotch whiskey. Or another way, which is similar, is out-fromming. When somebody says they want to be stricter than somebody else and they say, well, I'm not going to do this. And other people look at it and say, well, they don't want to be seen as being lenient, so they will copy it. And you get this social peer pressure to conform. And I have seen that. Out-fromming is a violation of the divine commandment. If you want to be frommer or stricter than somebody else, then you become a Nazirite. The commandment for becoming a Nazirite is there, and what you need to do is in the book of Numbers. However, that is tough. And it's tough for that reason. And so it's much easier to be out from than to become a Nazirite. And so what's happened over the years, it's like from a generic perspective, it's like boiling a frog. You put the frog in the cold water and you warm the water, and the changes are happening so gradually over a period of time, over the centuries, that we haven't noticed how ridiculous it's become. The frog didn't notice how hot the water was getting, and so the frog is cooked. What about the priority of the commandments? The Torah doesn't prioritize. Each is as important as the next. Perhaps we could prioritize them by the number of repetitions, or if it's in the 10 Commandments, does that give it a higher priority? And what about the repetition of positive treatment of strangers? Does that have a high priority? Or maybe there's a hierarchy, divine, rabbinical customs and traditions. So from a continuum perspective, I could ask the question, keeping which set or mix of commandments makes a Jew orthodox, progressive, conservative, or reform? Or does it have anything to do with the commandments? When I first came to Adelaide and went to the Orthodox Hebrew congregation, the rabbi's first question to me was, do you drive on the Sabbath? What has that got to do with anything? Or how about Hillel's golden rule? What is hateful to thee, do not unto thy fellow. This is the whole law, based on Leviticus. Is that the highest priority? You could argue that that's the system level commandment, and it's explained or ways of performing that commandment are listed in the other commandments, but there is no priority in them. Separation of church and state. The Torah split church and state. If you look in the book of Exodus, Moses became head of state, Aaron, his brother, became head of church, and the church remained with the priests and the Levites, and the state with the other tribes. The Hasmonean combined them after the revolt against the Greek Syrians, and modern Israel now has religious political parties in the government. So the scientific inference is that modern Israeli religious political parties taking part in the government violate the divine commandment, because church or religion is separate from state. And the state of the government in Israel provides an example of why the commandment exists. Think about that. 11th commandment. Big picture, Moses is addressing the people before his death, and we read the description in Deuteronomy chapter 4. First sentence, now therefore hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that ye may live and go in and possess the land which the Lord God your fathers giveth you. And it's my underlining. We get to the next one that says, ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. And I've added the underlining and the bold. Ye shall not add, neither shall ye diminish. And from the continuum perspective, there is a difference between adding and interpreting. So, temporal perception of adding and additions and subtractions. The Romans deleted the temporal commandments by destroying the temple. Originally, we could have classified the commandments as person to God, and temple. Now we only have two sets. The rabbinical commandments built a fence around the core, and they added things in case of accidental transition. I heard Orthodox Jews are not allowed to go swimming on the Saturday in case they squeeze a wet towel. Squeezing is a forbidden work on the Sabbath. Or they're not allowed to ride their bicycle on the Sabbath in case they get a flat tire and they mend the puncture. It takes a lot of fun out of life. Orthodox Jews can spend miserable Shabbats in hotel rooms at airports because the airport is in the middle of nowhere. They can't go anywhere. They've got nothing to do, whatever. The commandments are not meant to take the fun out of life. It leads to the transgression of divine as well as rabbinical commandments because children who rebel, they see the hypocrisy. They stop keeping both the divine and the rabbinical commandments because they don't know the difference. And the reform, they subtracted commandments. That takes a lot of Judaism out of life, and it leads to the assimilation because people don't know the difference between being Jewish and non-Jewish. I have family members and friends who've complained about their children marrying non-Jews. And I looked at them and I thought, but I kept my mouth shut. Why did you expect anything else? You didn't teach them what it was to be Jewish. There's nothing Jewish about your home. Why do you expect them? Surely it's more important that they marry a mensch, a nice person, an ethical person. God told Abraham, or God promised Abraham, that his descendants would be numerous. He never promised Abraham that his descendants would be Jewish and live according to rabbinical Jewish traditions. So, after some thinking about it, there is no divine original oral law. If you claim that there is one, you're violating Deuteronomy 4:2. There is rabbinic law based on interpretations and additions to fit changing circumstances, as documented in the rabbinical disputes in the Mishnah and the Gemara and the later writings. Those disputes in the Mishnah and the Gemara were not academic. Those people lived according to their ruling. And the stricter one in general died out. The warning in the commandment has come true. Additions have led to not keeping the divine commandments, as well as to evil in organized religion, which I'll get to. And subtractions have led to not keeping the divine commandments as well as assimilation. Leads to evil. Let's look at a couple. Keep kosher according to the rabbinic interpretation. I have an interesting book on the history of the London Board of Shechita. And you can see the reference down here, 1804 to 1954. When the first Jews came back to England after being, kicked out, the ones that came back were Sephardi from Holland and the Low Countries. They set up their own institutions and everything was going fine. Then came the persecutions in Europe, and the Ashkenazi came in from Poland and Russia, and they set up their own institutions as well. And so you now had 2 kosher boards, 2 rabbinates and whatever, and each one put a tax on meat and other kosher food to support their rabbinates. The reason you have 2 is not for religious reasons. They perform the same function. It's just the funding goes to the Sephardi rabbinate or the funding goes to the Ashkenaz rabbinate. And then amongst the Jewish community, there is this rule of basar chutz, out-of-town meat. The rule is there to protect the local butchers from out-of-town competition. Sounds good, right? Well, let me tell you a story. It's 50 years ago now in suburban Silver Spring, Maryland. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C. There was a community of young Orthodox living style married couples with small children, and their social life was based around the synagogue and meeting on and having meals at each other's houses on Friday night and Saturday lunchtime. And this one couple became well known for the quality of their meat. At that time, there was no kosher butcher in Silver Spring. You had to go into the Washington, D.C. to buy it. The meat was so-so, the service was so-so, and they did not deliver, and the neighborhood wasn't the best. So we come to this family, and wow, this meat is good. Where do you get it? Oh, my father is a butcher in New Jersey, 200 miles to the north, and when he comes down to visit once a month to visit us and the grandchildren, he brings a whole freezer full of meat. Ah, you think he could do it to us? I mean, he's already coming to the neighborhood. Don't know, I'll check. A little while later, a shopping list appears. Check off what you want, phone in the order, and it will be delivered on this and this date. Cash, please. I forget if it was cash or credit card. And that happened. And now you had this happy community with meat that was delivered that was really good. Well, the Washington butchers noticed that their customers, they'd lost customers and their income had gone down. So they complained. They found out why, and they complained to the local rabbinate. So Rabbi Winter one Saturday stood up in Southeast Hebrew congregation and announced that Moshe's meat from New Jersey is basar chutz, it is treif, it is non-kosher, and you have to tovel your dishes, you have to kosher your pots, and the dishes will probably have to be destroyed and thrown away. And some people did it. Most of the community ignored Rabbi Winter. A month or so later, there was an announcement that Moshe's butcher, 200 miles to the north in New Jersey, was under the supervision of the Washington rabbinate, and his meat was kosher. Don't tell me it's there. Don't tell me basar chutz is there to protect the local butchers. And similarly, somebody who's Orthodox is forbidden, or returned Orthodox, is forbidden by their rabbi to honor their non-kosher parents, a divine commandment, who live in a different city by visiting them, in case they violate the rabbinical commandment to keep kosher by eating their mother's home-cooked meal with kosher ingredients in it, or Torah-permitted ingredients in it. Or a couple of my experiences, I had a friend who was a progressive Jew, and I was living in the Orthodox community at the time. Her father died. I went one evening to visit the house of mourning, and I was asked to take the service. And it was the first time I was asked to take a progressive service that would be Hebrew and English, and it would be mixed. But I said yes, and I did it. A few weeks later, I was talking during the service, and we were talking about various, whatever it was, and I mentioned this situation, and before I could even say that, of course, I had done it, my friend said, "And of course you refused." And I looked at him, and I kept my mouth shut, and I'm sorry I did now. How could I refuse seeing the anguish in her eyes? That separation is evil. Same friend, in the same conversation or another conversation, I've forgotten which, mentioned that his sister, who had been living in an Orthodox community in New York, had left her husband and children and ran away with a non-Jew. The father had totally stopped speaking to his sister, and I said, "Well, how about you? She's your sister." And he said, "Yeah, I've stopped, cut off all communications. She's gone." And I thought about that. You fill in the blank. First of all, she's his sister. Secondly, there are two sides to every story. There is a reason for what she did. Have you tried finding out what it was? Maybe her husband is a person you wouldn't like to live with. And what about cemeteries? Why do we need two separate cemeteries for Orthodox and progressive Jews? What are they doing there? What are they doing in the cemetery that's different? My scientific perception says it's not much to do with religion. It's more to do with finance and control. Years ago, the rabbis built a fence around the Torah. These days, they're building fences around the community to separate their sect from the other sects and Jews from non-Jews. There was that line in Unorthodox where the rabbi's minder is talking to Moshe to send her out to bring Esti back. And he says, "She has to come back. You have to bring her back. We can't let her set an example of escaping." Nothing to do with her immortal soul. She's not allowed to escape from the control of the community. Enough of the heavy stuff. Something light. The Yizkor prayer. Look at its evolution. In around 1937, it was, "We beseech thee, Lord of compassion, shelter them forevermore under thy cover of thy wings, and let thy souls be bound up in the bond of life, and may they rest in peace upon their couches, and let us say, Amen." New Union Prayer Book, it says, "May they be at one with the one who is life eternal. May the beauty of their lives shine forevermore, and may my life always bring honor to their memory." Very similar, but there's this addition of me behaving in a way to bring honor to their memory. All right, now you go to Art Scroll. "I shall give charity on his behalf. As a reward for this, may his soul be bound in the bond of life together with the souls of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, and together with the other righteous men and women in the Garden of Eden." Do you see the difference? I shall give charity on his behalf. There's this evolution in the concept of the afterlife, has not changed, but the behavior of the person has changed. It's changed from may my behavior honor their memory. Was that it? My behavior honor their memory. Yep. May my life always bring honor to their memory. To, I shall give charity on his behalf. This is similar to the medieval Catholic indulgences as from the generic perspective. Conclusions for the ultra-orthodox or for everybody. While you may not be able to buy your way into heaven, your children can. I shall give charity on his behalf. So what does that mean? Don't upset your children. They may have the final say on how you spend eternity. So in summary, I summarized the holistic thinking perspectives, applied systems thinking and beyond to some Jewish issues to make you think about them, and I may have changed the way you think about Judaism, hopefully. The last few words. Ask questions, think for yourself. Always check the source. You can look it up in the internet or in books or even libraries. Amazon is a great source, not only of books, but using the look inside feature, you can actually look inside books and see what's written there. Sometimes you'll even buy the book. Dogpile is a great meta search engine. It looks up other search engines. Read up and research the topic. Use multiple sources and perspectives. And think critically about a rabbi's sermon. Think about the logic and the use of sources in there. I have not covered the critical thinking aspect of systems thinking in this talk. You can find it in other places. And lastly, and this is very important, don't confuse the message in Judaism with the messengers and with the people who misuse it. Thank you.